Hello and welcome to the Haaretz Podcast. I'm Alison Kaplan-Summer in Tel Aviv. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu appears determined to expand Israel's military operation in Gaza, moving towards a full-scale reoccupation of the Strip, despite the risks to Israel's hostages, against the better judgment of the IDF top brass, and in contradiction to Israeli public opinion, as poll after poll has shown. So what exactly is Israel's leader thinking? How will his clash with the military leaders play out? And will President Donald Trump stand in the way of his plans? Here with me to discuss all these issues, as well as reflect on the 20th anniversary of the event that many people believe started the march towards October 7th, Israel's 2005 disengagement from Gaza, is Aluf Benn, Editor-in-Chief of Haaretz. Our conversation is coming up.
I'm Esther Solomon, Editor-in-Chief of Haaretz English. Around the world, the fight is on to preserve critical and independent media. Haaretz, Israel's oldest newspaper, upholds its long tradition of accurate, committed, and incisive journalism, refusing to bend its reporting to pressure from any government or leader. A digital subscription to Haaretz gives you up-to-the-minute news and analysis in English from journalists who live Israel's reality and are committed to covering the Middle East and its global repercussions. At the same time, your subscription supports the cause of a free press that holds the powerful to account in Israel and around the world. I invite you to become a subscriber to Haaretz now. Just go to Haaretz.com and use the code Haaretz10, that's Haaretz with the number 10, for 10% off an annual subscription.
Aluf Benn, Editor-in-Chief of Haaretz. As always, thanks for taking time out of your busy day running the place to come down to our studio and join the podcast.
Hi.
Aluf, I want to start with your most recent column that addresses an issue we are always focused on because it really seems to be the thing that determines our fate. What is going on inside the mind of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu? Most Bibi watchers describe a man who, since October 7th, has been a political improviser, doing what he can to keep all the plates spinning, his far-right coalition partners, the ultra-Orthodox, the President of the United States. He doesn't seem to really care much about other world leaders, and managing the fallout from his criminal trial. But you challenge the premise that Netanyahu is the victim of circumstances, the hostage of his far-right allies, or just stalling to stay in power. You say that the fact that he is exploiting opportunities and buying time are not signs of lacking a strategy. They are the implementation of his strategy, a strategy that you describe as being, quote, clear and ruthless. So, Aluf, what is that strategy?
Well, the strategy of Netanyahu, since the inception of his career, even before he became a professional politician, has been to prevent the establishment of a Palestinian state. And, if possible, to diminish what he describes in his books and many other appearances as the hold of the Palestinian national movement, or the idea of a Palestinian national movement, over public opinion and especially over the foreign policy establishments in the West. First it was Great Britain during the colonial period, and since the 40s and 50s, the United States. And he would like to shatter that. And you could see that if his intention would only be to stay in power, why would he only choose one way of doing things rather than the opposite? For 15 years, he refused to meet with Mahmoud Abbas, with the Palestinian president. Since coming back to power in 2009, he refused to negotiate seriously with the Palestinians about any peace deal, even a partial deal. And he preferred the division, the de facto division of the Palestinians between Hamas and Gaza and the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank. And whenever they tried to reconciliate with each other, he intervened to stop it. Since October 7, obviously, that has changed toward a more aggressive action against the Palestinians after the Hamas attack of October 7. But even there, a year before the war, Netanyahu ran for his re-election and won his re-election by allying himself with the far right, with the Kahanists. And the Kahanist idea for decades is that Arabs and Jews should not coexist in the land of Israel. And since the Jews are the stronger, the Arabs should go. And now we see that policy implemented in Gaza, with official declarations that the way to end the war is to drive the Palestinians out of Gaza to third countries, away from the border, not across the border, but to Indonesia, to Libya, Ethiopia, maybe others, so that they won't be able to come back and attack Israel from the border, and then give the land to Jewish settlement. That is the official government policy.
So you think he has a meeting of the minds with these far-right Kahanist coalition allies, and it's not just political expediency that's pushing him to take actions that follows their vision?
It's not mutually exclusive. But I've yet to see one area of disagreement between him and Ben-Gvir and Smotrich. He's not always as outspoken as they are, but at least half of the members of the Likud faction in the Knesset say the same things as Ben-Gvir and Smotrich. So where's the difference? Clearly, the prime minister, any prime minister, has wider responsibility. And when Netanyahu, true to form, when he faces, as you mentioned, when he faces any controversial decision, he always likes to portray himself not as the head, but as the tail, as a kickball between the far right and the American president. It's convenient, but it doesn't change the direction. When you see more and more land grab in the West Bank, so Smotrich, who was in charge of that in the cabinet, likes to take credit for that, and not Netanyahu. Netanyahu doesn't talk about it all that much, but I don't believe that it's happening without his knowledge. It's always easier to pretend not to hide behind some underling or a coalition partner or military or what have you. But it doesn't matter. He's the leader. I don't think there's any other leader in Israel competing with him at this point. Whoever is trying to show any independence among the bureaucrats or military leaders or intelligence chiefs and so on is purged. So why can't we see that there is a strategy here? Netanyahu could have ended the war long ago. And the fact that he wants to escalate it, not just to prolong it as kind of a war of attrition with very little effort just to keep his coalition going. But no, he wants to escalate it.
So speaking of that, as a seasoned military correspondent, how do you view this brewing confrontation between the government and the IDF leadership over this newly, openly declared goal, it seems, of full occupation of Gaza? The Prime Minister's son is tweeting that the IDF chief of staff is behind, quote, a rebellion, an attempted military coup that is fit for a banana republic in Central America in the 70s. Eyal Zamir, the chief of staff at the last cabinet meeting, raged against that tweet. Do you think he's not long for his job, too?
Clearly, Eyal Zamir was nominated by Netanyahu only 5 months ago. After twice before, when Netanyahu wanted to appoint him as chief of staff and eventually someone else was nominated, Zamir is too independent for Netanyahu's taste. Netanyahu demands one thing from the bureaucracy, from the chiefs in the military and intelligence services, loyalty, personal loyalty. And he had made it clear. And whoever is not loyal is ousted. And we saw it with the former defense minister Gallant, former chief of staff Halevi, former security chief Ronen Bar, former head of the Knesset Committee on the Defense and Foreign Affairs, Yulia Edelstein.
The latest victim.
And the idea is to replace them with cronies. And at the beginning it's more difficult. But clearly if Zamir is gone, he will be replaced by someone who would just salute Netanyahu.
Do you think that will happen?
It's unclear. It can happen. Clearly, there's no trust between Zamir and Netanyahu at this point. I'm saying Netanyahu and not the government because the cabinet is just a choir to Netanyahu. There's no dissident there. Nobody there is saying, well, let's save the chief of staff because he's a great guy. And the other problem for the chief of staff is that he promised to change course in Gaza and to defeat Hamas and he ran this operation, Chariots of Gideon, and it failed. If anything, Hamas, I don't know their actual strength to fight the IDF. I don't think they got much. But in terms of their political survival, they surprised everybody in Israel. Most of the leadership was decimated, razed house after house, facility after facility, and yet they're still in charge, still holding the hostages.
So this latest announcement of an expansion of the IDF military presence into areas where the hostages are being held, again, in search of this total victory, has understandably deeply shaken the hostage families who are already in distress over these latest horrifying videos about the condition of the hostages. I guess we understand how this government is immune to criticism or moral conscience over dying and hungry Gazan Palestinians. But how can Netanyahu face the voters, if he has essentially sacrificed the remaining hostages, on top of unpopular moves like pushing ahead the effort to exempt the ultra-Orthodox from military service, reoccupying Gaza permanently, which is definitely not a popular move? Aren't these moves to presumably keep his coalition together now, or as you say, part of a larger strategy, especially when it comes to the hostages, handing his future political opponents a lot of ammunition?
Well, I think that in his mind, he never once, after October 7th, thought of this comprehensive deal with Hamas, like the all for all, bring back all the hostages and release all the Palestinians from Israeli prisons. I don't think he, even for 1 second, had this on his mind. And I think that at this point, what he sees is not the Israeli hostages. He sees what Hamas wants to get them free. And he sees the image of Marwan Barghouti, the former Fatah leader who's been in jail for 23 years. I think he's convicted to 5 life sentences for orchestrating all kinds of terrorist attacks during the second Intifada. And he's widely seen in the world as the equivalent to Nelson Mandela, the new Palestinian leader. And what Netanyahu sees is Barghouti coming out of jail, marking victory with his fingers. And this image runs around the world. And obviously for Netanyahu's political opponents at home, for Bennett and Lieberman, you see once again you sold us to the enemy, you surrendered. And Netanyahu can't take that. And I think this is the real issue. The prisoner release, and not holding on to this or that corridor in Gaza with few people outside the military who's fighting there, even know where it is. So this is the case. Netanyahu never wanted to bring back the hostages in these terms. And he won't. And what he did was to, as he did with the anti-coup pro-democracy protest, as he does now with this very little stop the war protest. He's trying to wait out the hostage families and bring them back now, bring them home now, protesters, to outlive them and just run the war the way he sees fit. He doesn't want to pay the price to get his hostages back. He never wanted to.
And you don't think he's worried about any election concerns and how this makes him look the man who let all these hostages die? Because
it's going to be Hamas's blame. But you could see that you always have to listen to all those people in the Netanyahu periphery in Likud, which are more outspoken. They tell the hostage families to shut up. They say that any call to bring back the hostages is just assisting the enemy. It's supporting Hamas. So it delegitimizes these families and their plea to save their loved ones from the dungeons of Hamas, which was unthinkable before the war. And Netanyahu gets away with it. And the question for Netanyahu is not about the majority in opinion polls. It is the majority in his own base and the ability of any other competitor to come up with a different vision. We have yet to see that vision. The only vision that Naftali Bennett, who's like the primetime competitor to Netanyahu in an election, came up with was the Haredi draft. And this is important, but it's mostly important to people who vote for Netanyahu anyway. So the question is that enough to peel them away from Netanyahu, towards Bennett remains to be seen.
Aluf, turning to the White House, Donald Trump was asked whether he supports reported plans by Israel to occupy the entire Gaza Strip. His answer, quote, "That's pretty much going to be up to Israel." And he said that what he cares about is feeding Gazans who are obviously not doing too well with the food, and that, quote, "Israel is going to help us with that in terms of distribution and also money." Do these remarks mean that we can close the book on the constant appeals by Israelis, by hostage families, to Trump to be the man who forces Netanyahu into ending the war and making a hostage deal? The hostage families seem to love his envoy, Steve Witkoff, but doesn't it seem like the U.S. is now writing off the hostages as well?
Historically, since the establishment of Israel, and even before, the U.S. successive presidents have given Israel largely a free hand vis-a-vis the Palestinians. Sometimes freer hand, like in Gaza in the past 2 years. Sometimes less so when Israel was pushed towards reconciliation with the PLO. But overall, Israel has the upper hand on the Palestinian issue. On other matters, when it conflicts with broader regional or global American interests, the U.S. is very quick to tell Israel where to stop. And you could see it when the same Trump told Israel to turn back its aircraft when Israel tried to push forward the attack on Iran's nuclear facilities to attack on the government, to topple the regime. This was too much for Trump or to other American allies in the region or what have you. Trump called it back. In the same way that the U.S. turned back the IDF in 1973 when it encircled the Third Egyptian Army and the road to Cairo was open. The same in 1956 when it forced Israel to give back the Sinai that it occupied in 5 days or 6 days. The same in 1949 when Israel invaded Egypt beyond the pre-war Palestine-Egypt border and Truman told it to come back. So the Americans know very well where to draw the line. And in Gaza, there was a hope that Witkoff and Trump would force Netanyahu into the second stage of the ceasefire, the beginning of the year, and then that they would force Netanyahu into a hostage deal. That didn't happen. And all Trump asked for was to get more food into Gaza, which is happening. More food is getting into Gaza. The other day I saw a Moroccan Air Force cargo plane flying to Ben-Gvir to get some food and then parachute it into Gaza. But clearly Israel has more or less a free hand in Gaza. The Trump administration relieved Israel from the partial embargo of heavy bombs and so on imposed by Biden. The Trump administration lifted all the sanctions on violent settlers imposed by Biden and some European countries and Canada. I don't see that changing unless Netanyahu appears as a loser. What we know about Trump is that he's always the fan of the winning team. You could see it on Iran. He hesitated until sending the B-2 bombers to join the Israeli attack because he wanted to see that the Israelis knew what they were doing.
So is our conclusion that by his lack of restraint, at least verbally, that Donald Trump has no problem with the reoccupation of the Gaza Strip on his watch?
On the contrary, Trump came up with the idea to relocate the Palestinians from Gaza and rebuild it as a resort. That was Trump's idea. I have no idea. We have yet to find out who planted the idea on his mind. But
obviously, a real estate developer.
Yeah, and obviously, I don't buy the idea that Netanyahu was devastated and shocked by the idea coming out of Trump's mouth back in February when they met at the White House. But still, that was the official Trump policy. And when Netanyahu mentions the transfer, the relocation, the voluntary relocation of Palestinians, he calls it the Trump plan, not his own. It's also a way to commit the American president to that. And you could see that Trump did not join America's European allies and the Saudis, America's other key regional ally, when they called to establish or recognize a Palestinian state.
Aluf, it's been 20 years since the Gaza disengagement, when Israel pulled out of Gaza unilaterally, which led step by step to the Hamas takeover, the building of their de facto terror state, the tunnels, the missiles. I'm fast forwarding here ultimately to October 7th. It's had a lot of coverage in the Israeli media this week. There's been a great deal from the right of saying, "We told you so," pointing to Prime Minister Ariel Sharon's decision to leave Gaza. And obviously, this whole campaign doesn't seem disconnected to what it looks like Netanyahu's government's intentions to reoccupy. You wrote a column in Haaretz countering the "we told you so's." Can you share with us some of your rebuttal, hindsight being 2020? Do you think that events have proved that the disengagement was, in fact, a mistake or not?
At the time, hindsight is a very nice way of looking at things, and counterfactuals even more so, because you can always say if this or that had or had not happened, then we would all live in a fairy tale. But this is not the case in Gaza. The opponents of the Gaza disengagement were right in their warnings that Gaza would turn, that the terror would not stop by removing the settlements and the IDF from Gaza. And that Israel cannot eventually just prevent Gaza from becoming hostile or even more hostile. I don't think that anybody at the time anticipated what actually unfolded in Gaza, which was the building of an underground fortress and planning and execution of a very daring idea of occupying parts of Israel and sparking what Hamas apparently hoped, sparking a wider regional attack all across Israel's borders from the north, from the West Bank, etc., and bringing Israel down. The harshest warnings were about missiles on Ashkelon and Ashdod. That point was passed years before. At the same time, Sharon was right, and Sharon did not promise Singapore and Hong Kong in Gaza. Those were ideas of Shimon Peres from the 90s. But when Sharon disengaged from Gaza, withdrew from Gaza, he had very little trust in the Palestinians. That's why he refused to negotiate with the Palestinian Authority, but rather decided to withdraw unilaterally. And to his last conscious day, he had made the most racist remarks about Arabs in general and Palestinians in particular. So it was not out of some love or appreciation to the Palestinians that he withdrew from Gaza. He was facing a dead end vis-a-vis the Americans who wanted to show something for a quid pro quo for letting him crush the second intifada in the West Bank and strengthen the Israeli presence there. And Gaza, the presence in Gaza was very unpopular. Many soldiers and settlers were killed protecting these settlements and the roads. And the idea was that you can withdraw. But Sharon also said that once Israel withdraws, it would get the legitimacy to attack Gaza again if it's not quiet. And guess what? Time and again, there were violent rounds in which Israel used ever-growing force against Gaza, against Hamas. And we could see it now. For 2 years, Israel has got, by and large, a carte blanche to attack Gaza with overwhelming force, with tens of thousands of Gazans dead, with the entire infrastructure, many of the towns and villages demolished, with people with very little food and let alone any, reasonable infrastructure, social services, hospitals, schools, and so on to live with. So Sharon was right, and his opponents were right. But the thing that the one thing that the right-wing commentariat not mentioning at all is that for 20 years or for 15 years, the opponents of the disengagement came back to power, led by Netanyahu. So they had 15 years to prevent the disaster which they warned against, right? But they didn't. And when Netanyahu was warned that war was imminent in 2023, he refused to deal with it. He refused to hold discussion because he was thinking this was politically motivated against his judicial coup. But the truth of the matter was that he was in charge. He should have prevented, he knew the Hamas plans, but he never believed, just like the rest of the Israeli establishment, they did not believe that Hamas would ever execute it. And that's why the blame lies with Netanyahu, not with Sharon.
Aluf, on the judicial coup, a question that's being asked a lot these days is the systematic erosion of the democratic underpinnings of the state, the judicial coup, which is hot this week in the news because of the sort of reigniting of the attempt to oust the current attorney general. Is this all aimed at getting Netanyahu out from under his criminal trial, or do you believe this is really Justice Minister Yariv's vision is something that Netanyahu personally shares, or is this just a question of his own self-interest?
It is a question of self-interest, but it goes way beyond the trial, which Netanyahu so far has handled quite successfully, pushing it away down the ladder of national agenda, getting a very, very soft treatment from the judges, and having his defense attorney more or less running the show there. But I think it's way more than that. Netanyahu wants to have more power and much less checks and balances on his power. And that's why he doesn't want independent judiciary. That's why he doesn't want independent state agencies with their own authority. That's why he doesn't want an independent or quasi-independent chief of staff who could have his own opinion matter, etc., etc. He wants to have full power. And the fear is that the thing is not just to oust this or that official, but to rig the next election in a way that would be less fair and that would make it far more difficult to replace the incumbent government.
Finally, Aluf, we in the media don't like to be the story, but I want to close out with asking you what it's like to be the editor of Haaretz during this very tense and troubled time and being the target of a lot of attacks. I don't know about you, but I'm used to being called every name in the book. Is this having any impact on how you view how Haaretz does its work? What's it like to be you today?
Well, first of all, it's the most interesting job to be in these times. As unfortunate as it may be, crises are where journalism excels, and it's been so since the last election. Before that, we had COVID, and before that, we had another political crisis. That's the way we do our job. And as a former writer on the triangle of peace, war, and politics, the interest peaks. Every day comes with a new surprise and a new story to tell, and competing ones. So I can't complain that it's boring in this job. Look, we're used to getting this kind of criticism because in Israel, at least, we're the only ones who cover the war from both sides. Most of the Israeli mainstream media ignores what's happening in Gaza. And to the extent they report on it, it's like, quoting the foreign media or criticizing the foreign media for serving Hamas propaganda, etc., etc. And when you ask colleagues from the mainstream TV channels, for example, why don't you air that footage? They say, well, our audience won't have it. So there is this kind of parallax between what the rest of the world sees about the war and what Israelis see about the war, which is mostly what's happening on the Israeli side and a lot of soul-searching and reruns of the October 7 massacre in the kibbutzim and military bases and the plight of the hostages. Now, we report about all these things just like everybody else, but we also report on what's going on in Gaza. It's not easy. You cannot have your reporters just traveling to Gaza. The ones who do that with, embedded with the IDF, which is an important story in itself, because you want to talk to the soldiers in the field as well, and do your best to do it when their minders are looking the other way, and so on. So this is also important. But you cannot just roam around freely in Gaza. Nobody can do that. We support the call of the international media to be allowed access into Gaza. I think it's crucially important, especially when the Israeli government cries against Hamas propaganda. Okay, allow the media to get their own first-hand impression of what's really happening there. But we can use our reporters to call people in Gaza, and they still have some electricity to power their cell phones and to hear from them about their own experiences. And obviously, we can rely on our syndications and partnerships with a host of global media like the New York Times, The Guardian, Wire Services, etc. It is difficult, but it's crucial. And you cannot really cover the story without hearing the Gaza side. And by the way, just as we do in the West Bank, where we cover settler attacks and the effort to drive out the Palestinians from wide areas in the West Bank. There you have freedom of access, relative freedom of access compared to Gaza. And we do that also way more than the other Israeli media.
Well, Aluf, I don't know whether I want to wish for you that it continue to be not boring. I think boring might be nice right around now. But
for a while.
I don't think we really have to worry about that issue. Aluf Benn, Editor-in-Chief of Haaretz, thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for inviting me.
And that's it for this episode of the Haaretz Podcast. Thanks to my guest, Aluf Benn, and to producer and editor Nara Malkin. If you'd like to continue to listen to the podcast and make sure that you never miss an episode, please subscribe to us on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And give us a 5-star rating. That way more people can find us. And to keep up with all the latest news on Israel, the Middle East, and the Jewish world, don't forget to subscribe and follow Haaretz.com. I'm Alison Kaplan-Summer, and until next time, shalom from Tel Aviv.